Good afternoon and welcome to the Robert J. Dole Institute of Politics at the University of Kansas, and thank you for attending today's program, which is presented in partnership with the Department of Military History at the Command General Staff College at Fort Leavenworth. My name is Michaela Wallace, and I'm a member of the Dole Institute Student Advisory Board, the official organization of the Institute. The Dole Institute of Politics strives to promote a new area of leadership that uses politics to bring people together through opportunities that emphasize bipartisan cooperation, public service, and civic education and engagement, all of which is inspired by the leadership and service of Senators Bob and Elizabeth Dole and the enduring civic contributions of the greatest generation. The Student Advisory Board is an integral part of this mission, providing members with experiential learning and job opportunities, access to financial assistance, and networking opportunities with our special guests. If you are a student here at KU and would like to join, please email us at dolesab@ku.edu or speak with a student worker after the program. Before we begin, there are a few reminders I'd like to take a moment to share with you. Following today's program, a video recording will be available to stream on demand on our YouTube channel, where you can access a full catalog of our past programming. A loop hearing system is available to use if you have a T-coil hearing aid. The Institute also has a limited number of listening devices if you have questions about the loop system or if at any time have difficulty hearing, please alert one of our staff members. Please take a moment to familiarize yourself with the marked exits in the room. In event of an emergency, please make your way to the nearest marked exit. Please follow the instructions of staff members and exit the building if necessary. Following today's interview, a limited number of audience questions will be answered. The Dole Institute aims to foster civil and respectful discussion around important and often difficult topics. Please phrase your question with this in mind. Finally, I'd like to remind you to please silence your phones or place them in Do Not Disturb. Now please join me in welcoming Dr. Abel, Associate Professor, DMH.
Thank you, Michaela, and thank you all for coming out on what turned out to be a very nice afternoon. I have the honor of introducing my colleague, Dr. Amanda Nagel. She is a 2014 PhD graduate of the University of Mississippi, and she has worked at the Fort Leavenworth, but not CGSC, for basically the time since then. Most of that time spent at the School for Advanced Military Studies, SAMS. She's also worked at West Point, among other places, and she has written and researched and published a great deal on the topic she is talking about today, which is how you integrate the United States Army specifically, the military in general, in a time of social upheaval and moving into modernity. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Nagel.
Good afternoon, and thank you all so much for taking the time on a beautiful afternoon to be here instead. I know you could probably be out walking and doing something else in the outdoors, but I appreciate that you made it in. So today, the subject today is kind of a little bit of both technology and innovation when it comes to looking at the U.S. Army, specifically when it comes to integration. And now I say technology and innovation. Now, You'll get hints of it throughout. I'm not going to very specifically talk about armor, aircraft, all those sorts of things, but you'll get hints of it, particularly when we talk through attrition, right? And so when it comes to integration, right, most people tend to think of the Korean War as how we understand integration in specifically the U.S. military. And mostly after President Truman signs Executive Order 9981, which declared that there would now be, quote, equality of treatment and opportunity for all persons in the armed services without regard to race, color, religion, or national origin. Now, while not explicitly ordering desegregation of the military, desegregation would be the only way the military could actually accomplish the goals that Truman set forth in this executive order. But however, the Korean War is actually not the first time integrated forces will fight for the United States, and specifically in the US Army. So during the American Revolution, there are approximately 5,000 African Americans who will serve in the Continental Army. And this is, of course, despite initial attempts by George Washington to actually have Congress ban their enlistment. And so yes, enlistment for African Americans was banned initially, even though many colonies actually allowed free African Americans to serve in their militias. But because of manpower shortages, as well as likely having to respond to Lord Dunmore of Virginia's proclamation that offered freedom to any enslaved black person who served for the crown, the Continental Congress will repeal this initial ban. So as a result, we have African Americans serving in integrated units in the American Revolution. And this actually includes the 1st Rhode Island Regiment. Now, most likely, you probably associated that specifically with African Americans, but the 1st Rhode Island had indigenous and white soldiers as well. So that was also an integrated force. Now, after the American Revolution, opportunities for African Americans to serve in the military start to dissipate. And it will essentially, with that, remove the possibility of continuing to serve in integrated units. However, African Americans do continue to serve the United States military throughout the 19th century into the 20th, albeit in segregated regiments with mostly white officers, right? During many conflicts in the 19th and 20th centuries, the question of whether or not African Americans could or should serve in combat units was frequently revisited, despite the fact that there's quite a bit of evidence of their abilities on the battlefield. Now, we know about some of those, particularly from the Civil War, right, the 54th Mass. And then this really all kind of comes to a head with the First World War, okay? Now, despite the creation of multiple all-black regiments after the Civil War, right, and they're going to be consolidated into the 9th and 10th Cavalry, the 24th and the 25th Infantry, and their continued combat experience throughout the late 1860s into the 1870s, all the way up to the 1916 punitive expedition, the question of their role in combat remained. As the US entered World War I, pressure from organizations like the NAACP resulted in increasing the number of African American officers serving in the US Army by doing things like creating a training camp that was actually not very far from here. It was up at Fort Des Moines, Iowa. Now, additionally, the American Expeditionary Forces are going to send over 2 divisions, provisional. They were never actually full divisions because artillery units were not placed with the 92nd and the 93rd Divisions. They were segregated and were composed of a combination of volunteers, draftees, and federalized National Guard regiments, okay? So it's really here where we can kind of understand the roots of what we're going to see in the Second World War, okay? And that's why I'm starting here. I promise I'm getting to World War II here soon. But the reason I think that the First World War matters for what's going to happen in the Second World War and how many officers are going to respond to this is because of what we see coming out of the First World War, and particularly with the post-war study at the Army War College in 1925. This document, this study determined that while African Americans should serve in the military, it specifically said that they should not serve in combat units, only in labor or engineering units, or when we get to World War II, transportation units, right? So the 93rd Division was the only AEF division that General John J. Pershing will allow to be amalgamated by the French Army. So basically what ends up happening is the 93rd will serve mostly attached to the French Army as opposed to the AEF during World War I. Now, what that meant was that the French were going to rearm, re-equip, and retrain these men to fight within essentially French tactics as opposed to using AEF tactics. And the other part of that is that the 93rd came over with probably the worst of the worst equipment that was essentially possible for AEF soldiers. Now, don't get me wrong, no AEF soldier was equipped very well. The First World War is a bit of a mess with that, right? But the 93rd and the 92nd seem to have received the worst of the equipment and arms available, and so the 93rd needed all of these things that the French were going to provide. They also benefited from serving under a different command structure, one that emphasized effective communication of orders all the way down to the lowest level possible. with detailed information, which was not exactly something that the 92nd was going to experience with the AEF. Now, as a result, the 93rd is going to spend almost 200 days consecutively in combat. They will also become very highly decorated. So they're going, like as a division, they will earn over 500 French Croix de Guerre, so the French medal, and 75 Distinguished Service Crosses at the time. Now eventually, this division will also boast 3 Medal of Honor winners, but only one will be bestowed that honor at the time, and that was actually one of the white officers. And his was awarded in 1919. The other 2 will be awarded, one in the 1990s and the other one in the 2000s. So comparatively, the 92nd Division will suffer from the AEF's command structure, with much more limited communication regarding orders that will actually result in not just disaster for the 92nd, but many other divisions who are at the Meuse Argonne. However, the 92nd will be the only division pulled from combat as a result. So when it came to this 1925 War College report that I've already mentioned, the 93rd Division's experience, their success on the battlefield, was actually treated as an aberration, while the 92nd was treated as the norm, when you have 2 very competing ideas of what occurred, right? So as a result, moving into the Second World War, based on this 1925 War College report, we do see the Army remaining segregated, both in terms of unit composition, but also assignments. And so African American units will be almost entirely relegated to to labor, engineering, and transport units. Now, of course, there are going to be some exceptions. We will see some assigned to combat arms. We'll see some assigned to flight squadrons. But in 1942, it's more concerning. Oh, I think I clicked on the wrong thing. There we go. There we go. Fixed it. In 1942, the concern became not just how many divisions the United States would be able to field, but how the United States would also be able to manufacture enough stuff to continue the war effort, and not just for the United States, but for its allies as well, right? And so that becomes a concern. So in 42, there's an idea that theoretically the US will need as many as 213 divisions. And I'm just talking Army. I'm not talking air, I'm not talking sea, I'm not talking Marines, just 213 US Army divisions to potentially win the war. Now, by the end of that year, the Army, and this includes General George C. Marshall, will discover the potential manpower problem that the United States faces. You need to be able to continue to produce. You need to be able to keep factories going if you're going to essentially provide the logistical base for the United States, the Soviet Union, and Great Britain, right? That's also because this is an attritional war. And so FDR is going to have to make some strategic decisions and emphasize the US industrial base continue. Therefore, the number of people you can pull for combat is shrinking significantly, because it's roughly the same pool of people that you'd want for the Army as you're going to want for industry. So essentially, because they're pulling from the same group of people, it comes down to the Army and the War Production Board figuring out a mobilization plan by 1943 that kind of shrinks that number of divisions down to about 100. Basically keeping the Army ideally at a total strength of about 8.2 million. That's still pretty phenomenal on its own, but that's not nearly as many as they would think, as they thought that they would be able to field. Now, the number is going to continue to shrink over the course of the year due to industry specifically competing with the Army, but also competing military services. Right? So in some cases, when folks are drafted or volunteer into the Army, they are going to immediately go to air units instead, because sometimes air units needed to be filled faster than ground combat units, okay? So this strain on available manpower to maintain combat power or even reconstitute divisions because of this attrition in the Second World War is going to result in the Army raising and activating only 89 divisions, all but 2 that would see combat by the end of the war. So this is where this all connects to integrated combat units in Europe, okay? So because of the attritional nature of World War II, the losses that the US has to absorb, and this continual emphasis that the US be the arsenal of democracy, so to bolster the Allied powers, more combat power in Europe needed, it had to come from somewhere. It needed to, but where? Right? And so war correspondent Ollie Stewart of the Baltimore Afro-American noted as early as 1943 that, quote, there are no color lines in the foxholes. So long before early 1945, which is essentially where we're mostly focused, soldiers are experiencing enemy attacks together, right? Because that's the thing about the Second World War, right? It's not just frontline troops that are experiencing combat. It's also labor battalions. It's also transport battalions. It's basically everyone who's providing service and support to those combat regiments, right? So other Black war correspondents are seeing the same sort of thing, right? They're seeing that when these enemy attacks occur, that combat arms and support units, because they are both under fire, they start to become more cohesive. Others are seeing this, and again, they'll see these observations throughout 1943 and 44. And what we end up seeing is that segregated units, like the 320th Barrage Balloon Battalion that you see pictured here, this is, by the way, possibly the only picture that exists of them actually in, like doing their job. This might be the one that exists. This battalion, they were the only African-American combat unit that will land in Operation Overlord on D-Day, okay? They will experience what Stewart was describing, this idea that there are no color lines in the foxholes. So their medics, so the medics that come along with this battalion are actually going to be providing as much medical care as possible to the injured around them. By the way, also sometimes suffering from injuries themselves. Okay? And after the war, medic Waverly Woodson will say, quote, they didn't care what my skin color was. So this sort of camaraderie, of course, has its limits. And frequently in the rear areas, we're going to see the type of racial tensions that were absent amid combat. But 6 months after Overlord, the Army continues to face a manpower shortage due to, of course, the intensity of combat, as well as how deadly the battlefield had become. So this is what I mean by that advancements, those advancements in technology. Artillery, armor, machine gunnery, aircraft, it's all much more advanced than it had been in the First World War. So the attrition rate is significant. Then you add in the Battle of the Bulge. This forced the Army to reconsider how it had approached reconstitution to this point. One of the problems was keeping enough people, again, like as I've already mentioned, keeping people enough people on the home front for the arsenal of democracy to produce this material to support the war effort. But also, to get to those 89 divisions, for each, it takes 1 year at this point to train a division. After the Battle of the Bulge, the US does not have time to wait for more divisions. It needs to figure out something now. So in early 1945, they need combat power, they need combat power fast. And so Lieutenant General John C.H. Lee, he was the commander of the US communications zones of the Eastern Theater of Operations, proposed a potential plan to solve this problem. reassign black service troops who volunteered for combat duty to mixed rifle units. Now, this solution's not necessarily popular with the War Department, since African Americans numbered less than 700,000 of the small portion of millions of Americans in uniform in January of 1945. Plus, during the 1943 mobilization conference, George C. Marshall will issue guidance to place African American soldiers where they would be, quote, best serve the war effort. So per the 1925 War College Report, that would be service units. So General Lee will actually go to General Benjamin O. Davis Sr., who at the time was the only African-American general officer in the US Army. And Lee will ask Davis to draft a memo for distribution. The initial memorandum will ask for volunteers to redesignate themselves as infantry to aid the war effort. That also, in some cases, meant that if they had received promotion within the ranks from when they started, they would lose that. They'd have to start basically back at a private. Yeah, but here's the thing. More than a few commanders in the Eastern Theater of Operations are going to resist Lee's memorandum and its implications. Now, some asserted that their opposition was because this memorandum directly contradicted the War Department, and specifically War Department policy, and thought that this would undermine combat effectiveness because of the potential for racial tensions, particularly between African American soldiers and white Southerners. White Southern soldiers. So commanders also held personal opposition to the idea of integration, which will influence their critiques of Lee's plan. Now, General Dwight D. Eisenhower, he heard all of these critiques. He acknowledged them, but in the end, he accepted Lee's plan with a little altered language, so it would at least somewhat remain within in line with War Department policy. So this is why they're going to create rifle platoons specifically from the volunteers. So when the program is finally opened, African American support troopers they will overwhelm this, quote, voluntary transfer program. That's what it was called. Lee and others initially estimated that they were going to get approximately 2,500 to volunteer. That was essentially the cap that they had placed on this. They got more than twice that. Yep, more than 5,000 men are going to volunteer to do this. And in part, it's not that surprising. I'm speculating here, but given the age of most of the young men who are going to go to war in World War II, most likely they grew up on stories of the First World War. Okay? So if they had heard some of these stories of African American soldiers in the First World War, they're going to want to do this because they're going to want to do something that was essentially, or at least they feel, was denied to the generation before them. To go into combat, to prove, sometimes it's just to prove that they can do it. But you add this and tie it to the Double V campaign, and it makes a lot of sense, right? Because with the Double V campaign, the idea is that it's a victory both at home and abroad against oppression, right? So for many of them, like, some of this is in the back of their minds as they're thinking through and deciding to do this. So when they're assigned to a service unit instead of a combat unit, they can't necessarily do what they are hoping to do. And so instead, they're going to volunteer, even if it means that they're going to die, simply because they know what combat means not only to them, but to their families, to their communities, and essentially to this long history of African American military service. So when the opportunity arises, they volunteer and they get put into a 6-week training course. So please note, I've already said that it takes 1 year to train a division. They're going to train these rifle platoons in 6 weeks. to get them out as quick as possible. Okay? Now, once they finished training in early March 1945, there were going to be 37 infantry platoons ready for combat. The final total was 53. Every single one of those platoons saw combat before the war ended in Europe, just 2 months later. So they will serve with both the 1st Army and the 7th Army. The 1st Army will leave them as platoons. The 7th Army reorganizes them into a company. They've trained as a platoon. They are now a company. So I'm sure you can imagine that's going to be a detriment to their ability to actually do their jobs well, because that's not how they've trained. So they're having to relearn on the job. Now, as a result, they are not going to perform as well. They also reportedly experienced lower morale since they felt treated like an experiment rather than fellow soldiers, rather like fellow comrades in arms. But to the rifle platoon's credit, they're not exactly wrong. Parts of the Army had started to consider the possibility of integration after the war ended anyway, even before we get to this point. So the potential for success or failure of these platoons was significant. So while the Army study remained focused on the perspective of white officers and white soldiers who served with these African-American platoons, it still came to the conclusion that others, including Dwight Eisenhower, had. Integration did not disrupt unit cohesion as much as they thought it would. And it also didn't lead to racial tensions, in part, again, because they're in combat. It's forcing them into this unit cohesion, right? So, of course, this isn't smooth, right? And so when General Benjamin O. Davis Sr. Was asked to go and visit the division commanders who had received some of these replacements, responses from the commanders were, as you can predict, obviously mixed. Some heaped praise on the replacements, and particularly that came from the 1st Army because they left them as platoons. From the 7th Army, instead, they're going to complain about the soldiers' competencies. So it's a mixed bag. But you do see coming out of it a lot of news, particularly in the African-American press, focused on things like this, right? Who likely just months before this, he had probably been either in a transportation or a labor battalion. But now, he's in combat, right? And this is, quite frankly, this is a very powerful image, right? It's part of why I chose it for today. But it's representative of even some of what we see with some of these surveys that the Army is going to conduct after the war. So after Germany surrenders, the Army will survey nearly 2,000 white officers and enlisted who served with African-American soldiers in these mixed units. The interviews are going to confirm other findings, that while initially, at least for some, they harbored reservations at integrated units, they later described black soldiers as excellent, specifically excellent soldiers, and friendly comrades in arms. Now, however, in the United States, there's still a lot of tension, and as we move into the post-war era, there were concerns in the Army that the evidence found in these reports might alienate Southern Democrats, or it'll pressure the Army to continue to go along this line. And so the Army will actually sit on the report for about 4 months. And it's only because someone, quote unquote, accidentally, yes, that's actually the word that was used to describe it, accidentally, left the report where someone else could, quote, grab a copy and release it, did it end up seeing the light of day. Now, the release of this report, of course, did not lead to integration after the war. Instead, it's going to take a combination of other reports and events, including the blinding of Sergeant Isaac Woodward in 1946 as he traveled home from his service in the Pacific. This is what's going to garner President Harry S. Truman's attention of this matter. So Truman, in the aftermath of Woodward's blinding and many other things that Truman starts finding out, he will issue Executive Order 9808 in December of 1946. And so this creates the Committee on Civil Rights. And they are essentially assigned to investigate civil rights in the United States. The committee will issue their report to secure these rights in October of 47. It called for equal voting rights, creating a civil rights division of the Department of Justice to investigate racial violence, equal employment, fair housing, et cetera, right? But what it's going to lead to, what it's going to lead to is really Truman kind of focusing on this. So he's going to go to Congress in early 1948, and he'll deliver a presidential message on civil rights to Congress. It's honestly one of the first times that we see a president doing this. And he's going to request that the legislative body of the government produce a series of proposals based on the committee's findings. He followed that up, of course, with Executive Order 9981, and he made civil rights part of the Democratic Party platform in 1948, right? So the president is very much invested in seeing this come to fruition, right? But it's not the executive order that's going to actually force the Army to shift its position on segregation. Once again, it's going to take an attritional war, right? Because despite the institution's own research, right, they've got plenty of research that shows this will not result in the tensions or negative impact on readiness. The Army's pre-war views of segregation as a, quote, matter of practical military expediency and not an endorsement of belief in racial distinction remained. While acknowledging that more opportunities should exist for African Americans to serve, the conclusion was to maintain segregation. It actually even results in Secretary of the Army Kenneth C. Royal Sr. resigning from his position in 1949 rather than implement official policies from the White House and the newly created Department of Defense. It's going to take the Korean War to shift this for the Army. And that attritional war comes much faster than anybody expected, right? No one expected another attritional war 5 years after the end of the Second World War. But in June 1940, when the Democratic People's Republic of Korea crossed the border, established in the aftermath of the Second World War, with intentions to unify the peninsula under a communist regime, that attritional war began. So, as we know, right, there's this multinational United Nations force, eventually dominated by the United States, providing military support to the Republic of South Korea. Now, for African American soldiers, the Korean War is going to represent a significant shift. And it's just, again, 5 years after the end of the Second World War. This is a significant shift. So before 1948, African American service members had this impetus to systematically break down barriers to equality and segregation represented, segregation represented, right? And this is kind of what I meant by the WV campaign, right? Now, after the executive order, it became both the continuation of segregation as well as de facto policies and interactions reflecting senior leaders' perceptions that impacted their service and potential role in combat units. Now, additionally, right, the U.S. is going to get rid of the draft, we're going to stop the draft after World War II, right? At least initially. So, as the U.S. demobilizes in the aftermath of the Second World War, right, this is a much smaller army by 1950 than we had in 1945, significantly smaller. But that also means it's relying upon volunteers. It's relying on people to go and enlist. Now, prior to March of 1950, the U.S. Army had a quota of how many African Americans it would accept, and that quota was 10%. So basically 10% of every year of those who are volunteering to join the Army, 10% of those could be African Americans. In March of 1950, the Army gets rid of that quota. Within a month, enlistments jumped to 22%. And by that summer, they reached 25% of all recruits. Okay? So just there, the Army is shifting in terms of its composition. Now, despite the increased enlistments and the executive order, segregation will remain the norm. And what that means is that instead of creating new units, they're just going to overload the current African American units that existed. So they're going to be overstaffed, while other units are going to be understaffed. So you can see the potential problems that are going to come from this once they get into combat, right? So additionally, they're not treated equally. So experiences early on under General Douglas MacArthur are going to fit with this norm. But it's going to be a much different story once we get to General Matthew Ridgway, when he becomes the commander of the Far East Command and the United Nations forces after the Truman-MacArthur kerfuffle, I think is what I'll call that. So from the outset of the Korean War, African-American soldiers are in combat. They're in it. They're in the thick of it. But their time under fire varied greatly depending upon who their commanding officer was. So in most cases, black soldiers will have white officers. Now, some of them perceived white officers assigned to black units as having been assigned there as punishment, as in they did something wrong somewhere else, or they just made someone really angry, and now they're leading African American soldiers. And so it seemed to kind of confirm this when many of these white officers are consistently trying to make a name for themselves. So that means possibly sending soldiers in to situations when you probably should not be doing that, right? That's probably a no-win situation. No matter how good the unit is, you're probably going to end up losing a decent chunk of them, right? So, well, again, this is not the case for every unit, right? It's common enough that soldiers who did not experience this type of leadership still knew about this type of officer. Now, also different from the Second World War is the presence of the U.S. press. It's in a vastly different way than what we saw with World War II. And so they're going to focus on these negative opinions and biases, thereby portraying this same sort of negativity for African-American combat units. Now, essentially, the mainstream press will describe similar actions by white or African-American units in different ways. So if a white unit conducted a regular retreat, a black unit, quote unquote, bugged out. They're doing the same thing, but it's being described in very different language, right? Some soldiers also suspected that their units were left undermanned and under-equipped, so it became easy to blame them for military failures. Whether accurate or not, these are the sorts of perceptions among soldiers that can significantly impact morale at a time when the Army really needed morale as high as possible to actually deal with the attrition that we were seeing in Korea. So due to this and many other incidents, it's really no surprise that morale in African-American units had declined, with many starting to actually question why they were in Korea in the first place. Why were they serving? Why? Why should they have to do this? Why were they securing South Korea's freedom from communist aggression? Right? When in their estimation, right, they're denied the rights that their citizenship should have guaranteed them. Why are they doing this? So maintaining segregation was not aiding UN forces to win in Korea. MacArthur's going to dodge the issue as best as he can. And some actually in the Pentagon will claim he had no interest in even addressing integration at all. So additionally, he's going to claim later on, and this is after the kerfuffle, he's going to claim that he would have liked to have more African-American soldiers than what he was sent after saying, like basically he said, well, I just took what Washington gave me. Washington gave me these men. I asked for men, this is who they gave me. If they'd have given me more African-American men, I would have appreciated that because I wanted more men, right? That's MacArthur. But he never attempted to actually ask for more, or more specifically African-American soldiers, but he's going to claim that after the fact. Now, additionally, he's also probably busier focusing on what he wanted to do in Korea than anything else. His chief of staff, General Edward Almond, also made it pretty clear that Almond thought African-American soldiers did not belong in combat, let alone the army. Now, upon discovering that there were some battalions in the 2nd Infantry Division that had already integrated, in part because, well, they needed to. They needed to reconstitute, and this was the easiest and best way to do so. Almond immediately ordered those forces to segregate again. He also removed Captain Forrest Walker from duties as a company commander after Walker led a successful bayonet and a hand grenade charge near Wonju in early 1951. And General Matthew Ridgway, who was then still commander of 8th Army, nominated Walker for a Silver Star. Coincidentally, Walker had served under Almond in the 92nd Division during the Second World War. So Walker was aware of Almond's personal views on African-American military service. So he was kind of prepared for this to happen. Now, aside from creating internal friction over segregation versus integration, it became difficult for these units to actually just maintain the segregation Almond demanded. For some officers, it didn't matter. If they were sent reinforcements, they didn't care who those reinforcements were. They were happy to see reinforcements. They needed them. And it's just because of the high levels of attrition that we see with the Korean War. Now, this was the case specifically for the 9th Infantry Regiment, part of the 8th Army, once an all-white unit. The 9th began accepting African-American soldiers into its combat units, and when questioned about this decision, one of the white commanders bluntly said he needed men. And these men were good fighting men. So what should he do? Turn them away, right? Like he needed these bodies. He needed these soldiers. And so when you have this combination of combat injuries, disease, et cetera, like commanders on the ground are clamoring for anyone they can get to reconstitute their units. So under MacArthur, it's all lower level commanders who are enacting in integration. It's not MacArthur leading the way. But this changes under Ridgway. First for the 8th Army, then for the Far East Command. So morally and religiously, Ridgway opposed segregation. He thought it was wrong. Now, of course, obviously that's going to influence his personal, and like this factors into his decision, but his main concern in December of 1950 was the 8th Army's morale and performance, which, if you know a whole lot about the Korean War at this point, it's not great, and that's putting it mildly, right? So according to General William B. Keene, who's Ridgway's subordinate in the 8th Army, immediate integration would likely boost morale and start shifting the conduct of the war. And he told Ridgway as much. And Ridgway later asserted in his book, The Korean War, that integration would restore the 8th Army's will to fight, particularly among its all-black units. Now, once in charge of the Far East Command, Ridgway implemented integration throughout the whole command area. He presented his plan for integration of forces to the Army, who approved it in July of 1951. So to ensure that this went smoothly, Ridgway limited African-American soldiers in combat units to at most 12% of the unit, right? And within 1 year, so now again, remember, in the middle of a war, reorganizing and shifting people around, Ridgway completes integration of the Far East Command in 1 year. Because to Ridgway, the problems associated with segregation would be what keeps the US Army from potentially accomplishing Washington's, and by extension, the UN's objectives in Korea. And with an attritional rate that eventually will reach 1,000, approximately 1,000 casualties a week by November of 1952, that alone, combined with a downsized force after the Second World War, plus multiple possible flashpoints around the world because of the Cold War intensifying, this is an impressive feat that he is able to accomplish. I think being able to do this in 1 year for an entire command. So Ridgway thought the only solution was just to make sure any able-bodied soldier was able to fight, regardless of race. Now, Army investigations to determine integration's effectiveness showed what Ridgway had already known. Once integrating together, serving together shoulder to shoulder, most white officers and soldiers supported integrated units, just like they had in the Second World War. So while integration doesn't fix everything when it comes to race relations in the Army, its implementation out of necessity is absolutely fascinating to look at, simply because what it does is so much more than what you would have expected it to do in the first place, right? The ability to adjust in real time, to retrain, equip, and shift soldiers from one part of a service to another, sometimes with significant muscle movements for the units involved. It signifies major reorganization that honestly, not many militaries can actually accomplish. So for the Second World War, as we've seen, right, this reorganization is on a much smaller scale, right? It's only about 5,000 men. It's not as extensive as what we see with Korea, but the overwhelming number of African-American soldiers who volunteered for combat showed not only their resolve to do their part in the war, but also the Army's ability to find ways to get the job done when constrained by manpower. In the case of Korea, a much larger reorganization under Ridgway signified that integration was not only doable, but it was imperative for a smaller Cold War Army to survive and potentially succeed militarily. The only way to succeed on the battlefield was to not deny soldiers the opportunity to fight or to keep them segregated. Integration led to a better, more effective army that only improved its performance once segregation ended. And there's plenty of evidence of that in Korea, where once you put many of these men together, they didn't start competing necessarily, but they made each other better. And then as a unit, they became better. Thank you. So if you're interested in reading some more about this, here are some of the many books that are out there on some of the topics that I touched on even briefly today. I think we're ready for questions.
I enjoyed your presentation very much. I couldn't help but wonder, as you were talking about World War II in Korea, if there were civilian groups active outside the military keeping track of all this and trying to promote integration of the force. Oh,
absolutely. Yeah, the NAACP was on it. The NAACP was actually a big proponent, both during the Second World War and the Korean War, to try to not only track this, but to pay attention to what was going on as integration was occurring. And they're actually going to be the voice, even in World War I, that pushes for this, right? So basically, their focus on African-American military service, it's a long and storied one, and to put it mildly. So one of the things that the NAACP will actually do is send Thurgood Marshall over to Korea This is while MacArthur was still commander of the UN forces and commander in the Far East. He was not pleased with this potential meddling by a lawyer. MacArthur actually tried to disrupt, I guess is the polite way to say it, disrupt Marshall's investigation in all ways. So what Thurgood Marshall was investigating was the high number of courts-martial that African-American soldiers and officers were experiencing in comparison to white soldiers and white officers. So when I mentioned earlier the varying ways in which the press would describe how African-American units versus white units would respond in combat, and when one is doing an orderly or a regular retreat, the other one is quote-unquote bugging out, that's going to be part of how and why you actually see more African-Americans charged with things like cowardice, dereliction of duty, et cetera. When white units are doing the same things, it's just there's a bit more grace given to them. So Marshall wants to investigate all of this. Well, one of the things that MacArthur does to actually try to to try to interfere, he went ahead and canceled Marshall's clearance to come out to Korea. Oh no, he straight up did. He worked all the little magic that 5 stars got, and he managed to work through the State Department and cancel Marshall's authorization, his clearance to go over to Korea. Well, this is where the NAACP is very good about this. They were on top of it, and as soon as that happened, they were at the White House, like almost instantly. And reportedly, when Truman found out what MacArthur had done, he actually blurted out, "Who's running this damn show?" So almost immediately, the decision got reversed. Marshall went over and did his investigation. And so, yeah, there's plenty in the NAACP records on both World War I and World War II concerned with these sorts of topics. And they're going to continue to be a heavy presence even into the Vietnam War when it comes to looking at what effect integration has had on not only the U.S. Army, but also the people who serve. Yeah. Thank you. That's a good question.
I was intrigued with the difference between the 92nd and 93rd Divisions in World War I, and apparently that their experiences weren't used as part of that 1925 study or report by the War College. Has there been later work on that looked at that as a case study of the attachment to the French Army and the 92nd remaining with the AEF, and how that played out essentially in World War I?
Oh yeah, there's actually a good wealth of scholarship that's been growing since probably the 1990s, looking at African Americans in the First World War, and so what we do see is that while yes, the 93rd is going to be kind of tossed out as it's the anomaly, the War College report is going to focus on the 92nd Division specifically, to prove that, at least according to them, that based on their investigation of all of the different things that were happening in 1918, that proves African Americans should not be in combat units, right? So and for the 92nd, they're the only division that gets pulled entirely from combat service after the Muse. They're the only ones. There are other divisions that also have the same problems, but they're given another chance in combat later on. But it comes down to sometimes it comes down to the commanders themselves, right? It comes down to who's in charge, what their interpretations are, and sometimes their own perceptions, their own biases that influence how they're going to approach their leadership and what they think a unit should do. So if you're interested, Chad Williams wrote many years, almost 10 years ago now, he published Torchbearers of Democracy. And so one of the things that he does look at is specifically the treatment of the 92nd versus the 93rd in terms of how domestically we were thinking about that, but also like what that meant for the Army and the AEF specifically, but also how and why the service for the 93rd with the French was different. Yeah.
Thank you for your discussion today. I see that some of these factors persist. I was privileged to serve as a 2-year Medical Corps draftee at Fort Polk during Vietnam. Named at that point for General Leonidas Polk, who of course was a West Point graduate, Episcopal Bishop of Louisiana, and a Confederate Major General. He was, the post was temporarily renamed for I believe, a Fort Jackson for one of your World War I Medal of Honor winners who was black, and since been renamed for James K. Polk. Have you a comment?
Well, I am at the behest of the Department of Defense and the Department of the Army. That is who I work for. That is my comment. I think at a certain point, it's the way that we look at and the way that we remember people and the way that we view history, it shifts and it changes over time, right? And I think that's going to influence and continue to influence how we look at this, how we name bases in the future, like who we name them after, why we're honoring them, all those sorts of things. That all factors into how we're looking at this. I would say I know there's a book coming out soon about some of what the commission did and when it came to renaming the bases. So if you're interested, I can give you that book. I think I can remember the book time. I can at least tell you one of the names of the authors about that. Ty Sidgley, who actually happens to be my former boss from when I was at West Point. He was the department chair in the Department of History when I was there. That he and another member of the committee wrote a book about what the process was like and sort of how they went about doing that and kind of, I think that's kind of just a good glimpse as to how we start over time thinking about something from the past and how that changes and why we honor who we honor, how we do that, all those sorts of things. That's, I think, the best answer, non-answer I can give you.
Can you tell us a little more about the African Americans who served in the Continental Army? Who were they?
Oh, okay. You're asking me, oh man, that's reaching back to my master's program when I was writing about that. Oof, you're asking about a long time ago, but it's okay. For the Continental Army, what we actually saw is a variety of people, right? So these are going to be free blacks. Some of them are going to be enslaved. So it's the same sort of thing that we see with the Civil War in terms of buying a conscript, so to speak, right? Buying a replacement, right? It's the same sort of thing that we see with 1863 and the draft riots in New York as a result of the frustration over who's getting drafted, who's not getting drafted, who can afford to pay somebody else to serve in their place, that sort of thing. So we see that with the Continental Army as well. There are going to be African Americans who will serve, and they're enslaved, and they're taking the place of somebody else because someone has worked out a deal with their slave owner, and in some cases it's a promise for freedom after the fact. Some cases it's not. And not all of those promises of freedom were honored, right? But in any event, when I was looking at this a long time ago and digging into some of even what Christopher Green, their commanding officer, was writing about, one of the things that struck me is that they were focused on the same sorts of things that everybody else was focused on when it came to the American Revolution and fighting for the Continental Army. They were thinking about liberty, They were thinking about all of those things that were fomenting with Thomas Paine, Benjamin Franklin, like all of these things that these men are saying, they're hoping it's going to extend to them as well. And so they're going to take part in part because of the kind of almost this promise of liberty. And those are the people that we're going to see that will take part in the American Revolution, at least for the Continentals. Now, you've also got what's referred to as the Ethiopian Regiment that comes out of Lord Dunmore's proclamation, right? And it's the same sort, like it's also enslaved men who will come to the British, and then eventually, like those are the folks who are going to end up settling in Nova Scotia after the fact, because they're not going to go transatlantic again, but the safe haven becomes Canada. Yeah. So that's there's also some good books out there on that too. Yeah.
Do you also have a program like this on the integration of women?
Not yet. We can. I'll talk to Dr. Abel and see what we can do. I do believe if you look on the Dole Institute YouTube site, Dr. Janet Valentine gave a talk here many years ago on that topic specifically, on women in World War II. So yeah, but we don't have one about that yet. I'll keep it in mind for a future one.
Excuse me. I think after World War I, there was an argument in the civilian population training blacks with arms. You know what I'm getting at?
I know exactly where you're going, yes, sir.
Did this affect decisions by the Army in the 1925 report?
So I can't say for sure. But what I can say is that there are probably a few Southern officers who were taking part in this war college report. That's definitely going to influence how they're thinking about and how they're reading the sources that they're looking at. So for the rest of you, if you don't know what this gentleman is referring to, one of the arguments moving into the First World War in the first place, so this is even before war is declared in 1917, there's a debate in Congress over the National Defense Act. And James K. Vardaman, senator from Mississippi, was very adamant that none of the new divisions that would be created, none of the new units that would be created with the National Defense Act in 1916 should be African-American units. And specifically, his concerns were, in part, that now you're training folks who have been, who are potentially a majority in some areas of the South. Self-defense, you're teaching them how to use weapons, and specifically rifles. And what if they bring that training back and they teach other people in their communities? What? Exactly, right? Yeah, right. But this is the sort of thing that Vardaman spoke about, right? And he's one of those folks who he runs on a platform of strict Jim Crow segregation, right? And white supremacy. So this is very much in line with exactly how he viewed this. And so he basically is viewing the sky is absolutely falling if you train African Americans, particularly from the South. Additionally, he was also concerned that those units might be used to turn on I think the way that he phrased it, I have to try to remember some of my writings and research, because I've quoted this because it's such a hefty quote. He said that there might be some president someday who doesn't understand how the South runs, shall we say, right? Like this is the implication, right? That there's gonna be a president one day who does not understand how we do things down here, so to speak. And they might use these new regiments to oppress the whites in the South. That was his basic argument. So there's absolutely that sort of thought process going on, absolutely. And I can't imagine, so Ned Almond, the one I mentioned, he's from Alabama. I can't imagine that's not part of his, he was from Alabama, I believe. Oh, not according to Wikipedia. Okay, that's fair, all right. Well, Louisiana, Alabama, sometimes it's the same thing, right? No, so well, he settled, it's Alabama is in my mind because when I was doing my prep for this, one of the things that popped up is his post-war, his post-military service life, and he was in Alabama. So that's, for some reason, that just stuck in my head, so. Right. And that's the thing, is that there's a lot of that influence. Additionally, we see this with World War I, we see it also with World War II, and it moves into Korea. There's this expectation among some in the Army that white officers for African-American units should be from the South, because theoretically, they are best equipped to handle African Americans because they were around them more often, theoretically, right? Like this is these are not right. This is not a logical argument by any stretch of the imagination, but this was in line with how people were thinking at the time. So, long answer to a short question, but I don't know for sure. I would bet that with where some of these men are from, and with some of essentially the baggage that they bring into the Army in the first place, some of this stuff is absolutely in the back of their minds as to what this might mean for African Americans to learn how to defend themselves, especially in the height of Jim Crow. Yeah. She's coming.
I've always been under the impression that by the time we get to Vietnam, especially the combat forces, that African Americans are overly represented, percentage-wise. Is that true? And up to the present day, what is the percentage of African Americans in the U.S. Armed Forces today?
Ooh, that's a good question. I don't know the exact numbers off the top of my head, but there's. I think there's, so for Vietnam specifically, there is absolutely this perception that it's more African Americans in combat than whites. Yes and no, right? It depends on who's being drafted, when they're drafted, right? So if we look at 1966 and beyond, that's when we start seeing the shift and seeing college students being drafted because, right, that exemption for them starts going away after 1966, 67. So that's gonna change the composition of who's being drafted. In some cases, they're gonna enlist because it's economically viable for them to do so, right? Because it offers a steady paycheck. That doesn't necessarily mean that they're overrepresented in some ways, but yeah, there's definitely that perception, right? And Martin Luther King is definitely gonna focus on that as he's talking about these things during Vietnam. And because we see what we see in Korea, right? There's also this expectation that because of what happened in Korea, well, you wanna be in combat units, I guess? Here you go, front line. Here you go, front line. You want this? I'm not sure you actually know what you want, right? That's the sort of attitude. But off the top of my head, I don't know the numbers for Vietnam and then today. I just don't. But I do know that it is approximately representative of the African American population in the United States. It's rough percentage-wise, it's about the same. Now, that's not enlisted versus, like, I'm not talking enlisted versus officer, because there's going to be a difference there too. But yeah, I'd have to actually take a look at the numbers. I don't know off the top of my head for today. Sorry. All right, if there are no more questions, thank you so much. I really appreciated having come today. Thank you.